Chapter 19. In spite of Vronsky's apparently frivolous life in society, he was a man who hated irregularity. In early youth, in the Corps of Pages, he had experienced the humiliation of refusal when he tried, being in difficulties, to borrow money, and since then he had never once put himself into the same position again. In order to keep his affairs in some sort of order, he used about 5 times a year, more or less frequently, according to circumstances, to shut himself up alone and put all his affairs into definite shape. This he used to call his day of reckoning. On waking up the day after the races, Vronsky put on a white linen coat, and without shaving or taking his bath, he distributed about the table moneys, bills, and letters, and set to work. Petritsky, who knew he was ill-tempered on such occasions, on waking up and seeing his comrade at the writing table, quietly dressed and went out without getting in his way. Every man who knows to the minutest details all the complexity of the conditions surrounding him cannot help imagining that the complexity of these conditions and the difficulty of making them clear is something exceptional and personal, peculiar to himself, and never supposes that others are surrounded by just as complicated an array of personal affairs as he is. So indeed it seemed to Vronsky, and not without inward pride, and not without reason, he thought that any other man would long ago have been in difficulties, would have been forced to some dishonorable course, if he had found himself in such a difficult position. But Vronsky felt that now especially it was essential for him to clear up and define his position if he were to avoid getting into difficulties. What Vronsky attacked first as being the easiest was his pecuniary position. Writing out on notepaper in his minute hand all that he owed, he added up the amount and found that his debts amounted to 17,000 and some odd hundreds, which he left out for the sake of clarity. Reckoning up his money in his bank book, he found that he had left 1,800 rubles, and nothing coming in before the new year. Reckoning over again his list of debts, Vronsky copied it, dividing it into 3 classes. In the first class he put the debts which he would have to pay at once, or for which he must in any case have the money ready. Such debts amounted to 4,000, 1,500 for a horse, 2,500 as surety for a young comrade, Vronsky, who had lost that sum to a card sharper in Vronsky's presence. Vronsky had wanted to pay the money at that time. He had had that amount then. But Vronsky and Yasmin had insisted that they would pay, and not Vronsky, who had not played. That was all well and good, but Vronsky knew that in this dirty business, though his only share in it was undertaking by word of mouth to be surety for Vronsky, it was absolutely necessary for him to have the 2,500 rubles so as to be able to fling it at the swindler and have no more words with him. And so for this first and most important division he must have 4,000 rubles. The second class, 8,000 rubles, consisted of less important debts. These were principally accounts owing in connection with his racehorses, to the purveyor of oats and hay, the English saddler, and so on. He would have to pay some 2,000 rubles on these debts, too, in order to be free from anxiety. The last class of debts, shops, hotels, his tailor, were such as need not be considered. So he needed at least 6,000 rubles for current expenses, and he only had 1,800. For a man with 100,000 rubles of revenue, which was what everyone fixed as Vronsky's income, such debts, one would suppose, could hardly be embarrassing. But the fact was he was far from having 100,000. His father's immense property, which alone yielded a yearly income of 200,000, was left undivided between the brothers. At the time when the elder brother, with a mass of debts, married Princess Varya Chekova, the daughter of a Decembrist without any fortune whatsoever, Alexei had given up to his elder brother almost the whole income from his father's estate, reserving for himself only 25,000 a year. Alexei had said at the time to his brother that the sum would be sufficient for him until he married, which he probably would never do. And his brother, who was in command of one of the most expensive regiments, and was only just married, could not decline the gift. His mother, who had her own separate property, had allowed Alexei every year 20,000 in addition to the 25,000 he had reserved, and Alexei had spent it all. Of late his mother, incensed with him on account of his love affair and his leaving Moscow, had given up sending him the money. And in consequence of this, Vronsky, who had been in the habit of living on the scale of 45,000 a year, having only received 20,000 that year, found himself in difficulties. To get out of these difficulties, he could not apply to his mother for money. Her last letter, which he had received the day before, had particularly exasperated him by the hints in it that she was quite ready to help him succeed in the world and in the army, but not to lead a life which was a scandal to all good society. His mother's attempt to buy him stung him to the quick and made him feel colder than ever to her. But he could not draw back from the generous word when it was once uttered, even though he felt now, vaguely foreseeing certain eventualities in his intrigue with Madame Karenina, that this generous word had been spoken thoughtlessly, and that even though he were not married, he might need all the 100,000 of income. But it was impossible to draw back. He only had to recall his brother's wife, to remember how that sweet, delightful Varya sought at every convenient opportunity to remind him that she remembered his generosity and appreciated it, to grasp the impossibility of taking back his gift. It was as impossible as beating a woman, stealing, or lying. One thing only could and ought to be done, and Vronsky determined upon it without an instant's hesitation: to borrow money from a moneylender, 10,000 rubles, a proceeding which presented no difficulty, and then to cut down his expenses generally, and to sell his racehorses. Resolving on this, he promptly wrote a note to Rolandok, who had more than once sent to him with offers to buy horses from him. Then he sent for the Englishman and the moneylender, and divided what money he had according to the accounts he intended to pay. Having finished this business, he wrote a cold and cutting answer to his mother. Then he took out of his notebook 3 notes of Anna's, read them again, burned them, and remembering their conversation on the previous day, he sank into meditation. Chapter 20. Vronsky's life was particularly happy in that he had a code of principles which defined with unfailing certitude what he ought and ought not do. This code of principles covered only a very small circle of contingencies, but then the principles were never doubtful, and Vronsky, as he never went outside that circle, had never had a moment's hesitation about doing what he ought to do. These principles laid down as invariable rules that one must pay a card sharper, but need not pay a tailor, that one must never tell a lie to a man, but one may to a woman, that one must never cheat anyone, but one may a husband, that one must never pardon an insult, but one may give one, and so on. These principles were possibly not reasonable and not good, but they were of unfailing certainty, and as long as he adhered to them, Vronsky felt that his heart was at peace and he could hold his head up. Only quite lately, in regard to his relations with Anna, Vronsky had begun to feel that his code of principles did not fully cover all possible contingencies, and to foresee in the future difficulties and perplexities for which he could find no guiding clue. His present relation to Anna and to her husband was to his mind clear and simple. It was clearly and precisely defined in the code of principles by which he was guided. She was an honorable woman who had bestowed her love upon him, and he loved her, and therefore she was in his eyes a woman who had a right to the same, or even more, respect than a lawful wife. He would have had his hand chopped off before he would have allowed himself by a word, by a hint, or even to fall short of the fullest respect a woman could look for. His attitude to society, too, was clear. Everyone might know, might suspect it, but no one might dare speak of it. If any did so, he was ready to force all who might speak to be silent and to respect the non-existent honor of the woman he loved. His attitude to the husband was the clearest of all. From the moment that Anna loved Vronsky, he had regarded his own right over her as the one thing unassailable. Her husband was simply a superfluous and tiresome person. No doubt he was in a pitiable position, but how could that be helped? The one thing the husband had a right to was to demand satisfaction with a weapon in his hand, and Vronsky was prepared for this at any minute. But of late, inner relations had arisen between him and her, which frightened Vronsky by their indefinite nature. Only the day before she had told him she was with child, and he felt that this fact, and what she expected of him, called for something not fully defined in that code of principles by which he had hitherto steered his course in life. And he had indeed been caught unawares, and at the first moment when she spoke to him of her position, his heart had prompted him to beg her to leave her husband. He had said that, but now, thinking things over, he clearly saw that it would be better to manage to avoid that, and at the same time, as he told himself so, he was afraid whether it was not wrong. If I told her to leave her husband, that must mean uniting her life with mine. Am I prepared for that? How can I take her away now when I have no money? Supposing I could arrange, but how can I take her away while I'm in the service? If I say that, I ought to be prepared to do it. That is, I ought to have money and to retire from the army. And he grew thoughtful. The question whether to retire from the service or not brought him to the other, and perhaps the chief, though hidden, interest of his life, of which none knew but he. Ambition was the old dream of his youth and childhood, a dream which he did not confess even to himself, though it was so strong that now his passion was even doing battle with his love. His first steps in the world and in the service had been successful, but 2 years before he had made a great mistake. Anxious to show his independence and to advance, he had refused a post that had been offered to him, hoping that this refusal would heighten his value. But it turned out that he had been too bold, and he was passed over. And having, whether he liked it or not, taken up for himself the position of an independent man, he carried it off with great tact and good sense, behaving as though he bore no grudge against anyone, did not regard himself as injured in any way, and cared for nothing but to be left alone, since he was enjoying himself. In reality, he had ceased to enjoy himself as long ago as the year before, when he went away to Moscow. He felt that this independent attitude of a man who might have done anything but cared to do nothing was already beginning to pale, that many people were beginning to fancy that he was not really capable of anything but being a straightforward, good-natured fellow. His connection with Madame Karenina, by creating so much sensation and attracting general attention, had given him a fresh distinction which soothed his gnawing worm of ambition for a while. But a week before, that worm had been roused up again with fresh force. The friend of his childhood, a man of the same set, his comrade in the corps of pages, Serpuhovsky, who had left school with him and who had been his rival in class, in gymnastics, in their scrapes and their dreams of glory, had come back a few days before from Central Asia, where he had gained 2 steps up in rank, and in order rarely bestowed upon generals so young. As soon as he arrived in Petersburg, people began to talk about him as a newly risen star of the first magnitude. A schoolfellow of Vronsky's and of the same age, he was a general and was expecting a command, which might have influence on the course of political events, while Vronsky, independent and brilliant and beloved by a charming woman though he was simply a cavalry captain who was readily allowed to be as independent as ever he liked. Of course, I don't envy Serpuhovsky, and never could envy him, but his advancement shows me that one has only to watch one's opportunity, and the career of a man like me may be very rapidly made. 3 years ago, he was in the same position as I am. If I retire, I burn my ships. If I remain in the army, I lose nothing. She said herself she does not wish to change her position, and with her love I cannot feel envious of Serpuhovsky. And slowly twirling his mustache, he got up from the table and walked about the room. His eyes shone particularly brightly, and he felt in that confident, calm, and happy frame of mind which always came after he had thoroughly faced his position. Everything was straight and clear, just as after the former days of reckoning. He shaved, took a cold bath, dressed, and went out. Chapter 21. "We've come to fetch you. Your reckoning lasted a good time today," said Petritsky. "Is it over?" "It is over," answered Vronsky, smiling with his eyes only, and twirling the tips of his mustache as circumspectly as though, after the perfect order into which his affairs had been brought, any overbold or rapid movement might disturb it. "You're always just as if you'd come out of a bath after it," said Petritsky. "I've come from Gritsky's," that's what they called the colonel. "They're expecting you." Vronsky, without answering, looked at his comrade, thinking of something else. "Yes, is that music at his place?" he said, listening to the familiar sounds of polkas and waltzes floating across to him. What's the fete?" "Serpuhovsky's come." "Ah," said Vronsky, "I didn't know." The smile in his eyes gleamed more brightly than ever. Having once made up his mind that he was happy in his love, that he sacrificed his ambition to it, having anyway taken up this position, Vronsky was incapable of feeling either envious of Serpuhovsky or hurt with him for not coming first to him when he came to the regiment. Serpuhovsky was a good friend, and he was delighted that he had come. "I'm very glad." The colonel, Demmin, had taken a large country house. The whole party were in that wide lower balcony. In the courtyard, the first objects that met Vronsky's eyes were a band of singers in white linen coats, standing near a barrel of vodka, and the robust, good-humored figure of the colonel surrounded by officers. He had gone out as far as the first step of the balcony, and was loudly shouting across the band that played Offenbach's quadrille, waving his arms and giving some orders to a few soldiers standing on one step. A group of soldiers, a quartermaster, and several subalterns came up to the balcony with Vronsky. The colonel returned to the table, went out again onto the steps with a tumbler in his hand, and proposed a toast. "To the health of our former comrade, the gallant General Prince Serpuhovsky. Hurrah!" The colonel was followed by Serpuhovsky, who came out on the steps smiling, with a glass in his hand. "You just get younger, Bondarenko," he said to the rosy-cheeked, smart-looking quartermaster standing just before him. It was 3 years since Vronsky had seen Serpuhovsky. He looked more robust, had let his whiskers grow, but was still the same graceful creature, whose face and figure were even more striking from their softness and nobility than their beauty. The only change Vronsky detected in him was that subdued, continual radiance of beaming content which settles on the faces of men who are successful and are sure of the recognition of their success by everyone. Vronsky knew that radiant air, and immediately observed it in Serpuhovsky. As Serpuhovsky came down the steps, he saw Vronsky. A smile of pleasure lighted up his face. He tossed his head upwards and waved the glass in his hand, greeting Vronsky, and showing him by the gesture that he could not come to him yet because the quartermaster was before him. "Here he is," shouted the colonel. "Yashvin told me you were in one of your gloomy tempers." Serpuhovsky shook the hand of the quartermaster and headed towards Vronsky. "How glad I am," he said, squeezing his hand and drawing him to one side. "Look after him," the colonel shouted to Yashvin, pointing to Vronsky, and he went down to the soldiers below. "Why weren't you at the races yesterday? I expected to see you there," said Vronsky. "I did go, but late. I beg your pardon," he added, as he turned to the adjutant. "Please have this divided from me, each man as much as it runs to." And he hurriedly took notes for 300 rubles from his pocketbook, blushing a little. "Vronsky, have you had anything to eat or drink?" asked Yashvin. "Hey, get something for the count to eat. Here it is, have a glass." The fete at the colonel's lasted a long while. There was a great deal of drinking. They tossed Serpuhovsky in the air and caught him again several times. Then they did the same to the colonel. The colonel himself danced with Petritsky. Then the colonel, who began to show signs of feebleness, sat down on a bench in the courtyard and began demonstrating to Yashvin the superiority of Russia over Poland, especially in cavalry attack. And there was a lull in the revelry for a moment. Serpuhovsky went into the house to the bathroom to wash his hands, and he found Vronsky there. Vronsky was drenching his head with water. He had taken off his coat and put his sunburnt, hairy neck under the tap, and was rubbing it and his head with his hands. When he had finished, Vronsky sat down by Serpuhovsky. They both sat down in the bathroom on a lounge, and a conversation began which was very interesting to both of them. "I've always been hearing about you through my wife," said Serpuhovsky. "I'm glad you've been seeing her pretty often." "She's friendly with Varya. They're the only women in Petersburg I care to see," answered Vronsky, smiling. "The only ones?" said Serpuhovsky, smiling. "Yes, and I heard news of you, but not only through your wife," said Vronsky, checking his hint by a stern expression of face. "I was greatly delighted to hear of your success, but not a bit surprised. I expected even more." Serpuhovsky smiled. Such an opinion of him was obviously agreeable to him, and he did not think it necessary to conceal it. "Well, I, on the contrary, expected less. I'll own that, frankly. But I'm glad, very glad. I'm ambitious, that's my weakness, and I confess to it." "Perhaps you wouldn't confess to it if you hadn't been successful," said Vronsky. "I don't suppose so," said Serpuhovsky, smiling again. "I won't say life wouldn't be worth living without it, but it would be dull. Of course, I may be mistaken, but I fancy I have a certain capacity for the line I've chosen, and that power of any sort in my hands, if it is to be, will be better than in the hands of a good many people I know," said Serpuhovsky, with beaming consciousness of success. "And so, the nearer I get to it, the better pleased I am." "Perhaps that is true for you, but not for everyone. I used to think so, but here I live, and I think life worth living not only for that." "There, it's out, here it comes," said Serpuhovsky, laughing. "Ever since I heard about you, about your refusal, I began. Of course, I approved of what you did, but there are ways of doing everything, and I think your action was good in itself, but you didn't do it in quite the way you ought to have done. What's done can't be undone, and you know I never go back on what I've done. And besides, I'm very well off. Very well off for the time. But you're not satisfied with that. I wouldn't say this to your brother. He's a nice child, like our host here. There he goes," he added, listening to the roar of "Hurrah!" "And he's happy, but that does not satisfy you." "I didn't say it did satisfy me." "Yes, but that's not the only thing. Such men as you are wanted." "By whom?" "By whom? By society, by Russia. Russia needs men. She needs a party, or else everything goes and will go to the dogs." "How do you mean? Bertenev's party against the Russian communist?" "No," said Serpuhovsky, frowning with vexation at being suspected of such an absurdity. "That's always been and always will be. There are no communists, but intriguing people have to invent a noxious, dangerous party. It's an old trick. No, what's wanted is a powerful party of independent men like you and me." "But why so? Vronsky mentioned a few men who were in power. Why aren't they independent men?" "Simply because they have not, or have not from birth, an independent fortune. They've not had a name. They've not been close to the sun and center as we have. They can be bought either by money or by favor, and they have to find a support for themselves in inventing a policy. And they bring forward some notion, some policy that they don't believe in, that does harm, and the whole policy is really only a means to a government house and so much income. I may be inferior to them, stupider perhaps, though I don't see why I should be inferior to them, but you and I have one important advantage over them for certain, in being more difficult to buy. And such men are needed more than ever. Vronsky listened attentively, but he was not so much interested by the meaning of the words as by the attitude of Serpuhovsky, who was already contemplating a struggle with the existing powers, and already had his likes and dislikes in that higher world, while his own interest in the governing world did not go beyond the interest of his regiment. Vronsky felt, too, how powerful Serpuhovsky might become through his unmistakable faculty for thinking things out and taking things in, through his intelligence and his gift of words, so rarely met with in the world in which he moved. And, ashamed as he was of the feeling, he felt envious. "Still, I haven't the one thing of most importance for that," he answered. "I haven't the desire for power. I had it once, but it's gone." "Excuse me, but that's not true," said Serpuhovsky, smiling. "Yes, it is true. It is true now," Vronsky added, to be truthful. "Yes, it's true now. That's another thing. But that now won't last forever." "Perhaps," answered Vronsky. "You say perhaps," Serpuhovsky went on, as though guessing his thoughts. "But I say for certain. And that's what I wanted to see you for. Your action was just what it should have been. I see that. But you ought not to keep it up. I only ask you to give me carte blanche. I'm not going to offer you my protection, though, indeed, why shouldn't I protect you? You've protected me often enough. I should hope our friendship rises above all that sort of thing. Yes," he said, smiling to him as tenderly as a woman, "give me a blank check, retire from the regiment, and I'll draw you upwards imperceptibly." "But you must understand that I want nothing," said Vronsky, "except that all should be as it is." Serpuhovsky got up and stood facing him. "You say that all should be as it is. I understand what that means. But listen. We are the same age. You've known a greater number of women, perhaps, than I have." Serpuhovsky's smile and gesture told Vronsky that he mustn't be afraid. He would be tender and careful in touching the sore place. "But I'm married, and believe me, in getting to know thoroughly one's wife, if one loves her, as someone has said, one gets to know all women better than if one knew thousands of them." "We'll be there directly," Vronsky shouted to an officer who looked into the room and called them to the colonel. Vronsky was longing now to hear to the end and know what Serpuhovsky would say to him. "And here's my opinion for you. Women are the chief stumbling block in a man's career, and it's hard to love a woman and do anything. There's only one way of having love conveniently without it being a hindrance, and that's marriage." How am I to tell you? How can I explain what I mean?" said Serpuhovsky, who liked similes. Wait a minute. Yes, just as you can only carry a fardeau and do something with your hands when the fardeau is tied on your back, and that's marriage. And that's what I felt when I was married. My hands were suddenly set free. But to drag that fardeau about with you without marriage, your hands will always be so full that you can do nothing. Look at Mazankov, at Krupov. They've ruined their careers for the sake of women." "Ah, what women?" said Vronsky, recalling the Frenchwoman and the actress with whom the two men he had mentioned were connected. The firmer the woman's footing in society, the worse it is. That's much the same as not merely carrying the fardeau in your arms, but tearing it away from someone else. You have never loved, Vronsky said softly, looking straight before him and thinking of Anna. Perhaps, but remember what I've said to you. And another thing, women are all more materialistic than men. We make something immense out of love, but they are always quite down to earth. Directly, he cried to a footman who came in. But the footman had not come to call them again, as he had supposed. The footman brought Vronsky a note. A man brought it from the Princess Verskaya. Vronsky opened the letter and flushed crimson. My head's begun to ache, and I'm going home, he said to Serpuhovsky. Oh, okay, well, goodbye then. Do you give me a blank check? Oh, we'll talk about it later on. I'll look you up in Petersburg.